Hello, this is the unretired engineer coming at you again to talk about the Small Business Innovative Research Grant Program as run by the US government. So SBIR. So just, basically the structure is phase one, phase two, phase three, phase one being concept, proof of, phase two basically being development of some process or product, and then phase three is really commercialization. And at phase one and phase two, you have to talk about commercialization, how you are going to take this and deploy it broadly as a technology solution that is of interest to whoever the SBIR sponsor is. My experience was with the DoD and the Navy in particular, but the other departments all have various versions of SBIRs, and then there are STTRs, which are more academic-based programs as well. They all have very similar structures, and they have similar limitations. So we're going to be talking about phase three, where quote unquote programs go to die. The reality is a lot of programs are pretty successful, even when they don't get to phase three in any formal sense. But the issue is often kind of promulgated from a government lawyer, bureaucrat viewpoint that, oh, there's a phase three, you're supposed to get to phase three. Well, it doesn't necessarily need to go to phase three to be technologically advantageous, but that's just the thing. And the reality is that the failure of to go to phase three is very structural. It doesn't have anything to do really with engineering. This is my view from 20 years in the belly of the beast, both working for the government and then working for a company, and actually writing proposals to the grant program and winning them and then moving forward. But also looking in at a lot of other programs, both from when I was in the Navy and doing SBIR programs from the other side as well as later. So I've talked about this before, the exception that proves the rule. Yeah, at the Naval Avionics Center, which is what the organization that I joined when I started into engineering, we scrap more than 10% of our hybrid microelectronic modules because we would test everything and then do the final packaging, lidding in particular, and then test the device again and it would fail. And most of the time you were unable to delid the device in a way that allowed you to get inside and fix it. When you're talking a failure rate 10% or sometimes significantly higher, that's a lot of money when you're talking modules which were often $1,000 or multiple thousands of dollars. So the company, there was a request for proposals in SBIR world put out. A company put in a proposal, and but that company was in the business already. They provided equipment for the hybrid microelectronics world, small at a small scale, not big, expensive, high volume, smaller stuff, which is actually where the majority of military hybrid microelectronics lived, right? It was a relatively low volume type stuff. So they were in that market, selling to that market. They knew this problem. They had just never been able to come up with a solution for it and then work that. So it was one that they had thought about, and they had a solution which was mechanically relatively straightforward, but required custom precision design and machining of custom components. And the SBIR Phase II paid them to do that. So, it was easy to demo. It was easy to say, oh, there's a big value for it. And the fact is, they were already in the market. And when they delivered the product to the Navy, the NAC could then say to other suppliers to the Navy, look, there's this solution for this problem we've all been having, and they could push it forward without getting into trouble with or commercially. And then the company could sell that. And that program never reached any kind of formal phase three. They essentially were able to sell, and they did a phase three in the sense that they commercialized that product. But it wasn't like they went out and found extra money or anything else. They commercialized within the structure of their company and made good money, and basically saved the government hundreds of millions of dollars over time, relatively short period of time, because this was a systemic problem at that time that had been resolved. This is a very positive solution, but it basically had the bones of its bones built in from the very, very beginning. So, most of the time, you don't think of it this way, but most problems when you talk to getting to the phase three is they are relatively small scale problems. They're not huge. But most of the time, they're a small business, right? So there's a means and ends disconnect. They don't have $2 or $3 million to put at risk. They need an investment. They need a program which is going to buy the product that then allows them to get money from the bank to go build that thing and deliver it. A lot of people say, well, there's VC funds and all the rest of that. Well, the reality is that VCs most of the time are interested in bigger problems and bigger paybacks. Most of the things that SBIR solve are relatively niche, and they're relatively small. Yes, there are big ones, and ones with big knock-on potentials, but most of the time they're pretty small, and the VCs just aren't interested. But then again, you turn around and say, in a lot of cases, the companies that started doing SBIRs do get VC funding eventually. But usually at a later stage, after the company has gone through several rounds and multiple SBIR programs, not always related to each other, and they've developed a portfolio of technology, and the VCs are basically either buying into that portfolio or they're buying into the management who have successfully shown that they can solve problems and bring them to the market, or at least to the edge of the market. And that's where they're interested. So the reality is that valley of death is still there, right? It is, and the reality is SBIRs can get you to the edge of it, but it doesn't get you over it unless there is something else there. There is a project that the DoD or Navy or whoever has that needs that solution and can say, okay, well, you've proven you can do it. Now I'll buy 100 of them. It's somewhat what the delidding machine was, right? But in many cases, there isn't that. That doesn't exist, and so the technology essentially goes into hiatus for a while. So, one of the ones that people talk about are iRobot. And the fact that was $16 million worth of project, right? So, okay, so this is one of those areas, right? An SBIR in phase three is a way that the government can put money into a program without a lot of overhead. They don't have to go out because the technology is already proven and it basically the company exists. The money can be allocated to go buy something that company has proven and shown. So it is a route into the world, right? So that it is of value. But the thing about iRobot that is interesting is that what they were selling at that time were PackBots, right? Basically for disarming bombs, going into dangerous places and whatnot. They were essentially mini tanks. It isn't the Roomba that we all think of as the output of iRobot. There is no real military use case for a Roomba unless you're going to go blow up your cat. Um, the technology that they developed pivoted away from those packbots to other solutions. The packbots went on. They're still very, very prevalent in that space of disarming bombs and going into dangerous places and, disaster relief and whatnot. Big, big area, but it's actually a small market. And iRobot got over. They developed a technology. They took the technology they developed there and put it into the Roomba, and they grew the company. The interesting thing is reality is the company pivoted away from what they were supplying to the military and what the military was interested in, and it never really came back. The people and the technology and all the rest of it that had been developed all went on to evolve and come back to the military, but it doesn't come back through iRobot. It came back through other means. So it's an interesting story, and you can certainly spin it to say that it was a success. It was, but it really goes to prove that it is much more about an overall technology development proof of and developing people and IP more than a product, right? And it's not always it's usually not clear cut that that one leads to the next in a very clean way. So I said I was going to talk about my experience on the commercial side of the SBIR. So I worked for a company called Satcom for about 9 years. And 6 of those I was working on SBIRs. I won about 1 in 4 phase ones that I offered for, and did more than 3 a year, and 4 a year, more than 4 a year, I think. And then about half of those went to phase two. But there were 0 phase threes. And, it goes back really to one of the fundamentals, and that this fundamental being time. The reality is you put in, you are put in for a phase one. So you receive the request for, and you write it and you put it in. There is a delay. You are accepted. You have to go through the negotiations. You do the phase one work. You send in the report, and along with a phase two proposal. That all has to be reviewed. You get, and then if the phase two is accepted, the negotiation for that is much more limited, but it's still there. You do the phase two work, and then you do the reports on that, and you know, basically talk about what your next phase three is going to be. The reality is that in 6 years, you're almost, by the time you talk about the first year lag and then last year kind of starting discussion, there were only a couple of them which were reaching the point of a phase three at that point, and we never reached that point. um, I left the company at that point, moved on to another one. Part of the problem was that that company was at the stage where it was doing a lot of commercial work and developmental work, but it essentially looked at SBIRs that work was for the military and it needed to be cost plus, and they weren't willing to invest their own funds at risk in that effort. And that's fair enough to a certain degree. And we had developed some technologies which were under another government program called AIPM, which we had used as kind of precursors into the SBIRs that we were then looking. And we were looking for basically how to build out, how to take all these pieces of technology and move them on. And, we probably were getting to the point where we had some ideas about what to do, how to take that, what to do about it, but I moved on and that never came to fruition. Um, the upside, downside, whatever you want to call it, is a technology we were proposing actually in the end became very common in industry. We had developed what is now called the overmolded power module, which is a relatively small power module, testable item that does away with the cold plate that a conventional power module has, and it just has an insulated metal, insulated ceramic metal sandwich on the back of it that is very effective when soldered or sintered directly to a cold plate in a power module. This is the technology that is in most electric cars these days. It allows you to pre-test the modules and make sure that they're live before you put a bunch of them into a car inverter, and spending a lot of money that you might be wasted because of rework and whatnot. So it's a very common technology today. We were one of the first who demonstrated it and kind of put it out there as an idea, but it wasn't any direct line from one to the other. And essentially Tesla had the advantage of they had the scale. They had an application which made absolute sense for that technology, and they had the ability to pull that technology in and put it out, right? So you could say that that is a success in the long term. It took 20 plus years, but in the long term, a lot of that technology came through. And so it does prove the technology portfolio viewpoint and the technology advancement, but it also says that, in of itself, the SBIR has a relatively low chance of making it big. Because the reality is you just don't have enough mass there to pull the technology through and make it successful. So, from the SBIR manager viewpoint, treating it as a portfolio of technology development where you say have 20 different projects and maybe one is a pretty big success and two or three others are minor successes, the others all basically fade into the woodwork. But even those that fade away are not losses. They have trained engineers, they've developed IP, they have allowed experimentation with ideas, which is the lifeblood of technology advancement. And they help move the whole infrastructure forward in their own way. And as with that overmolded module, it will spring up and take hold when there is an application that makes sense. So it's not always a straight up loss. It's just very hard to account from the accountant or the bureaucrat's seat. So, from the participant, the problem really becomes it tends to drive you towards being a cost plus shop, which is not always good. And, you really have it really pushes you against swinging for the fences. And that mismatch is largely the value. One thing that you could say is the Navy has a pretty good success rate. In 1999, which I know now is quite a while in the past, they had a 53% success rate of getting products to the market. And, I think they've continued that. And again, a lot of the problems within the Navy are very niche. And they, in often cases, that they do have a need for it that then allows them to pull it back out of industry. So the SBIR kind of provides an innovative solution. It becomes available. The Navy then can pull it through using, as I said, the tools that is easier to do programs through an SBIR, which has gone to the phase 3 level. So it has those advantages, but they're not going to, by and large, be huge wins and easy to talk about, and be great, your generic YouTube bait. So the reality is it narrows the SBIR narrows the valley of death, but it doesn't do away with it at all. And essentially, as I said, one of the issues is that it tends to drive some firms towards stop trying to go to phase 3. They tend to get stuck in phase 2. Some companies just kind of move away from it. They get the technology gains that they needed, and they then kind of move on. And that in itself is a success. Um, and sometimes they can be called mills, but the reality is even then, it's never going to be a major funding source, and it's always going to be a somewhat successful in developing kind of that technological background. And it's not really a loss, but it's very easy to be critical of the program. So that is what it is. So anyway, so that's kind of my second take on phase 3 small business innovative research grant projects, and the intrinsic problems with that third phase. It doesn't say don't go after them. I'm very much positive on SBIRs. I think they're a good tool. And I think they're useful, and they're a good training ground for projects, for engineers, for companies, um, over and above the big wins that sometimes come out of them. So I think it's all good. Again, that's my viewpoint from the unretired engineer. Hopefully it gave you something to think about. So hit the like and the subscribe. And I'll be back to talk to you about engineering projects, systems, science fiction in a little while. Cheers.